beam sabers, an iconic weapon throughout sci-fi and robot franchises. Whether they are impenetrable rods of pure energy capable of cutting through any and all materials, or if they are powerful torrents of plasma rushing out of a handle, capable of melting or slicing through robots, melee weapons with blades made of energy or plasma are a staple of the genre, and Mega Man is no stranger to this fact. Zero, the Red Maverick Hunter, with his insanely long ponytail, is perhaps only known better for his signature weapon, the Z-Saber, a sword handle which emits a beam of energy, usually in the shape of a blade, specifically a katana of some sort. But is this always the case? Well, actually, Zero's saber blade is less consistent than you think, sometimes simply being a pointy stick or perhaps even a rod, or even just a massive rushing torrent of plasma like a blowtorch flame. But why is that? Is it simply different interpretations of the same weapon, or is there more to it than that? Well, as we dive into this topic, I hope to break down the uses of beam blade technology, the different kinds of blades there are, and the various shapes they may take on. But I won't bury the lead any further, let's cut to the chase. Now, there are many kinds of beam weapons in the Mega Man franchise, but before I get into all the different types, I think we need to establish a baseline for how they work, their basic attributes, and some ground rules and facts about them. So follow along, and we'll eventually get to other types of beam weapons. And just so you guys know, this is not going to be an exhaustive list of every kind of beam weapon. If I did that, this video would be exceedingly long for no reason. Just like I didn't list every kind of buster, the point of these videos is to explain the technology and principles behind how they work, not showcase every single example of something. Because by the fifth example of someone using a beam saber, I'd just be repeating myself over and 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 over. Beam weapons appear first in the Mega Man universe in Mega Man X1, when the leader of the Maverick Hunters turned Maverick, Sigma, first dashed into us during his first form battle. Sigma throws off his cape, pulls out his saber hilt, and in a flash, a green blade extends from the handle. Right away, I want to establish that there is no stated power source for most beam weapons, unlike with busters, where the weapon is part of the user's body, and we know the energy usually comes from their internal power core. Beam weapons are usually little more than a handle with a blade that comes out of it. My best guess is that the weapons are powered by the user holding them, somehow transferring their energy into the handle of the weapon itself. Either that, or there is some sort of rechargeable battery inside which refills whenever the weapon is holstered, and then it pulls from the user's internal energy. Either way, I just wanted to get that out of the way for the sake of being thorough. There is currently no documentation on this subject that I'm aware of, so we'll just have to use our imaginations. But getting back to Mega Man X1, during the fight against Sigma, when swinging the saber, it leaves behind a distinct trail as well, not unlike a certain other energy blade weapon from a popular science fiction movie franchise, which may or may not be the direct inspiration for Sigma's beam saber here. I am, of course, talking about Star Wars. There, I said it. Just get it out of your system now, because where we are going will demonstrate that despite their obvious inspiration, beam weapons in Mega Man function drastically different in practice. In fact, they are much closer to the beam weaponry found in the Gundam franchise, which, as we know, Mega Man draws heavy inspiration from at times. So, get that out of your system too, because Mega Man beam weapons function differently from those as well. Anyway, moving on. Sigma seems to also be able to block shots with his saber blade, protecting him from harm. Not unlike redirecting blaster bolts with a lightsaber in Star Wars. Though luckily for us, he only seems to be able to knock them away and not directly back at us. So what are the characteristics of a beam saber in the most basic sense that we can gather from this first exposure to the technology? When swung, they leave behind a trail and make a cool sound. Presumably, they can cut things. If projectiles hit the blade of the saber, they are deflected or destroyed. Something to note here is that Sigma's beam saber in this instance resembled a straight green rod. It seems to have a rounded tip, not unlike a contemporary lightsaber. Clearly, the Star Wars influence is still very strong in this first outing. Moving on to Mega Man X2, our dear friend Zero has undergone a series of upgrades, overhauling his appearance as well as his weaponry, granting him a new buster as well as the powerful Z-Saber. We don't see much of this Z-Saber in X2, but from the looks of it, we can already tell that it has some different characteristics to the ones seen in Mega Man X1. When swung, rather than remain a straight rod, the beam appears to bend and curve with the momentum and motion of the swing. In addition, it would appear the blade is capable of releasing blade beams of some kind, effectively throwing a crescent of energy, presumably with all of the same cutting capacity of the Z-Saber itself. It's pretty awesome. Alright, so this shows us that beam weapons can have multiple blade types. Some are straight and rigid, while others create more of a slashing arc when swung with enough force. Moving on to X3, Zero is back once again with his Z-Saber, only this time, the blade once again looks a little bit different. Judging by the sprite, when Zero swings his Z-Saber, the blade remains rigid and straight, but has a curving arc behind it, like the saber trails we mentioned earlier. Strangely, in Zero's official artwork for X3, he is shown swinging his blade in a massive crescent shape, something we are about to see a lot more of in the following game. Assuming that Zero has not gotten yet another Z-Saber between games, the way I explain this discrepancy in blade consistency is that perhaps Z-Sabers can be configured or tuned to various settings. These settings would in turn alter the functionality, appearance, and cutting potential of the blade. This is something we will see a lot of going forward in the series. This could even be an in-universe explanation for the discrepancy in the color of Zero's Z-Saber. In all of the artwork, it appears to be some sort of cyan blade, but then in the games, the blade is green. I know that I've covered this topic in other videos, usually chalking it up to in-game visibility, but it's nice that now we might have some sort of in-universe explanation. Moving on to Mega Man X4, we come across the first time a beam weapon is the primary form of attack, really getting to see just what exactly it can do. The first thing you'll notice is that when Zero swings his saber, it appears to flare out in a massive arc, similar to how it did in Mega Man X2, but to a much more exaggerated degree, pretty much perfectly mimicking the crescent seen in Mega Man X3's artwork. In addition to this, when Zero performs a particularly large slash with his saber, the energy of the blade can be seen hitting the target multiple times. This can be taken a number of ways. Either this is the game's way of representing the blade cutting through the target in a particularly large draw of the blade across their surface, or perhaps it is indicating the amount of energy being surged through the target. Either way, the resulting wave of energy from this large swing is powerful enough to destroy most enemies. Also of note is the sound that the saber makes when swung. When he swings it, it no longer makes that low-pitched VUM sound that it did previously. Instead, it makes a much more gnarly sound, almost like some sort of electricity, as if the raw plasma is not cutting through the air, but now burning through it. This seems to coincide with the more wild nature of Zero's blade crescent when attacking. Mega Man X4 reveals something very interesting about beam sabers as well, during one of the animated cutscenes. Near the end of the game, Sigma and Zero have a flashback together, where Sigma encounters Zero for the first time as a Maverick. Zero is a crazed maniac in this battle, and is sporting his appearance from Mega Man X1, as he had not undergone the upgrades he would later get in X2. As Sigma gets pushed onto his back foot during the battle, he draws his beam saber. Of note is that Zero in response draws a pipe? Zero pulls a pipe from the scaffolding and accepts Sigma's challenge. The two collide in their attacks, and surprisingly, Zero is able to block Sigma's saber with the pipe. A lot of people at this point were probably like, how is that possible? Lightsabers should cut right through that. And you'd be right, if this were Star Wars. This cutscene goes to show that beam sabers are actually not capable of cutting through everything like the lightsabers they were inspired by. Instead, it would seem that if they collide with a sufficiently durable surface, they will not be able to cut through it, and in fact, the Beam Saber will behave as though it were a physical blade, colliding with another physical blade. Eventually, Sigma's Beam Saber does cut through Zero's pipe, even seemingly shattering it. Perhaps this is the result of the pipe coming under the stress of the Beam Saber energy surging through it. So even if a beam weapon functions similarly to an ordinary physical blade, it would seem that the energy aspect to it does make the blade far more destructive, so there is still reason to use beam blades over normal ones. If you banged two swords against one another over and over, all you would do is ruin the edge on your blade. Maybe if you were hitting a really crappy sword, you might be able to break the blade. But at the end of the day, you're just whacking two pieces of metal together. A beam saber blade seems to retain all the cutting capacity of an ordinary blade, with the added advantage that it will never get dull. You can't exactly dent a stream of plasma. On top of this, anything you hit with your saber, even if it doesn't cut through it, is likely going to get burnt or zapped with the energy of your blade for additional damage. This changes everything. Up to this point, Z-Sabers have seemingly given off the impression that they are unstoppably powerful blades of energy, cutting through any and everything like a hot knife through butter. After all, in X2 and X3, the Beam Saber pretty much one-shots anything it comes into contact with. But perhaps that was merely a limitation of the gameplay of the time. If we take the fact that Sigma's Beam Saber cannot cut right through Zero's metal pipe, it would seem that beam weapons act more like regular bladed weapons than we realize. In fact, Mega Man X4 is full of examples of this. In one of X's cutscenes, he is shown blocking Colonel's Beam Saber with his bare arm, and Colonel himself has a habit of resting his hands on his saber as though it were a cane. If this were a lightsaber style weapon that cuts through everything with no resistance, Colonel would find himself falling over anytime he tried this. This is clear evidence that despite being made out of energy, beam weapons in Mega Man have actual physical rigidity to them. And just as a side note, while I am still on Colonel, we can see in-game that Colonel has a rigid rod-style beam saber, much like Sigma's from X1, while Zero's is a crescent blade when swung. This proves that there can in fact be multiple types of saber blades. Otherwise, Colonel and Zero's blades would match in their depiction, but the fact that Zero can have this big crescent slashy blade, and Colonel can have his stiff, straight rapier-style blade on screen at the same time, tells me that the type of blade a beam weapon has is not predetermined or part of the art style, but in fact, a function of how that particular weapon works. Also of note is that Colonel's straight blade saber makes a much softer sound when swung. Perhaps the difference in sound between Zero's saber and Colonel's is the blade type. Stepping out of the games for a moment, if we look at the official art for Zero for X4 and onwards, we can actually see that his saber varies in shape. In some artwork, it appears to be a pointy straight blade of some type. In another, it appears to be a familiar katana shape. And in others, it is once again a crescent blade due to the intense motion of Zero's swing. If we peek back at the opening for Mega Man X4, we also see that Zero and Colonel are trading blows with their respective beam sabers, both of which appear to take on this crackling surge of plasma style to them. This matches Zero's blade in-game, but is very clearly not how Colonel's blade functions in-game. You could chalk this one up to an animation error, but I think this one's a little too large to overlook. Once again, I am left to assume that the style of blade you have relies on the settings and configuration of your particular weapon, meaning that the individual user has the option to change what kind of blade they have. In Mega Man X5, not much changes for Zero's blade, staying pretty much identical to how it functioned in X4. However, I would like to take this time to mention that X5 introduces a shot eraser ability which can be equipped to Zero. This allows the Z-Saber to cut bullets out of the air and negate them, not unlike Sigma in X1. Whether this is something that the Z-Saber itself needs to modify its blade, or if this just gives Zero the accuracy to cut down the shots, is unknown. Each option presents its own set of contradictions, so I think I just chalk this up to a gameplay mechanic. I think it's fair to assume that saber blades can always catch or deflect projectiles. In Mega Man X6, Zero's beam saber gets an overhaul once again. Now we can see that in-game, Zero's saber is a straight blade, somewhat like Colonel or Sigma's. Also of note is that the sound his saber makes is different once again. It's not quite as gnarly as it was in X4 and X5, but it does sound a bit more fast. Perhaps this blade configuration is somewhere between the crescent style and the straight blade style. As a side note, when X uses Zero's saber in X6, it is the same crescent blade as seen in X4 and X5. This must mean that there must be multiple blade types in-universe to explain how both characters can be using the same Z-Saber but achieve different blade results. Either there is more than one Z-Saber, or they change the configuration based on preference when they take it into battle. Either way, once again, we have a game with two in-game depictions of different saber types at the same time. Moving on to X7, Zero appears to have struck a balance once again between the straight blade and the crescent style, though you wouldn't think so given its appearance. Now, rather than sporting a katana style blade, Zero's saber appears to be a pointed straight blade, but it isn't perfectly straight, it's actually more like some sort of energy spike. Also of note, the sound has changed once again, perhaps to reflect this new configuration of the blade. Now when swung, the blade creates a sort of crackly electricity sound, somewhere between the swift cutting sound of X6 and the gnarly sound from X4 and X5, with emphasis on the energy pulsating through the blade. As we've seen in the intro to X4, beam sabers tend to flare up with electricity when under the stress of impact, so this electric sound as the blade cuts through the air makes sense as it fries the air molecules along its path. Also of note, in X7, it would seem that by default, Zero is now able to reflect shots back at attackers. Unlike Shot Eraser, which caused shots to fizzle out, Zero is able to hit them back towards their owners, solidifying the idea that this is a property inherent to beam sabers. In fact, Zero even gets an ability in X7 to take a defensive stance, very similar to Sigma's from X1, where he will automatically reflect shots as they impact him. X8 also has a similar blade type to this, though in artwork it is once again depicted as a sort of katana blade. Not too much more to say here. As we've already established, multiple blade settings and all that jazz. As we move forward in the timeline, however, we seem to come across a new kind of blade. I am of course talking about the Mega Man Zero Hero Dorito. Or maybe it's the cake server spatula. It's the big honkin' triangle blade. I should mention before I get too deep into this, that in Mega Man Zero 1 and 2, in-game, Zero's saber is katana-shaped, but in all artwork for the Mega Man Zero series, Zero and many other characters are depicted as having triangular-shaped blades for their sabers. The triangle-shaped blade only appears in-game as the default shape of the blade by Mega Man Zero 3. Otherwise, it is only a triangle under special circumstances, such as when using certain EX moves. Like the X series, perhaps different blade types can be configured for the same weapon. What's more is that in addition to having a triangular-shaped blade, there doesn't seem to be that little flashy bit that comes out of the base of the saber. As you can see here, there is usually this flickery bit of energy where the beam is emitting from. Admittedly, other saber blades did not always have this either, such as Sigma or Colonel, but I just felt it was important to mention that these new blades seem far less wild and much more refined, perhaps even sharper than usual. Throughout the Zero series, we see that when an enemy is defeated with a Z-Saber, they are actually bisected along some axis and then fall apart, just like in an exaggerated samurai movie or anime or something. In my opinion, I like to believe that these new, translucent, and very flat style blades are actually sharper than their X-series counterparts. That would certainly explain the much softer whoosh whenever they are swung, as they effortlessly pass through the air, and of course the immensely cool split that guy in half effect they added. This could simply be a new piece of visual flair for the series, however. In previous games, the enemies would just explode when defeated by the Z-Saber, but there was at least a special hit spark indicating a sort of cut was happening, so it's not as if Z-Sabers lacked any sort of cutting power previously. The Zero series is simply taking this effect one step further. Even so, I still like to believe that these new blades are somehow more effective, more sharp, and perhaps more dangerous. It would seem that they no longer crackle with electricity or make loud noises of energy fighting to retain their shape. These new sabers are closer to their lightsaber granddads in that they do seem to be able to cut through anything. Not by virtue of the energy being so strong it melts, but rather by the fact that these new blades seem to be razor sharp. Although, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that when you do cut enemies in half, there is a red-hot outline along the area of the cut, indicating that these Z-Sabers are indeed still made of very potent and hot energy. The Mega Man Zero Z-Saber also introduces us to the ability to charge up your saber, allowing Zero to unleash a massive slash, which results in a large flare-up of energy in front of him, obliterating anything in the way. However, according to sources, this ability is granted via X-Buster technology being incorporated into the saber at some point. The ZX era's beam weapon technology seems to remain largely unchanged from their Mega Man Zero predecessors, so I don't have too much more to add regarding that. Their blades seem to function pretty much identically, although I have noticed that there is a little bit more blade variety in terms of shape. And before you nag me about it, yes, I am aware that the Z-Saber in those games can transform into a Buster Shot as well, but this video is about the blades. Whew, that was a lot of information. So let's recap what we know about the basics of beam weapons. Number 1. Perhaps most importantly, beam blades still behave like physical blades made up of solid matter, but retain their sharpness due to being made of energy. The energy component also deals additional damage, and can be seen burning through enemies when cut. Number 2. There are more than one types of blades, which may have different effects on their target based on the blade type. Some of the most common blade types include straight blade, crescent, pointed, katana, and as we will see in the next section, the shapes beam sabers can take are virtually endless. Number 3. The same weapon can seemingly be configured differently for different blade types without requiring a whole new weapon. Number 4. Different blade types appear to result in different sounds as they are swung. Number 5. Blades can deflect or absorb energy and projectiles that contact them. Number 6. In the Mega Man Zero era, beam sabers appear to be translucent and paper thin, and more often than not, are triangle shaped for some reason, taking on a more geometric shape as opposed to traditional blade types. With that said, I think this is the basic groundwork for beam saber style technology. Now that we have this basic understanding, we should look at some of the special features and unique types of beam weapons found throughout the series. Sticking to Zero for a moment, one of the biggest features of Zero's Z-Saber is its ability to transform its blade into a variety of different kinds of elemental blades. Fire, ice, electricity, and even transforming into a massive metal broadsword. Zero's Z-Saber is able to change its properties based on the special techniques that Zero learns from defeated enemies. For instance, Raijingeki, which Zero learns after defeating Web Spider, allows him to thrust his saber forward in a long-range stab, dealing continuous damage to anything skewered onto the blade. Rather than the usual green energy we see, the entire blade becomes a beam of continuous thunder and lightning. Likewise, Ryoenjin has Zero performing a jumping, rising uppercut with his saber, where the entire blade turns into a flame. It would appear that in addition to his usual set of moves, Zero is able to augment the blades of his Z-Saber, not just in its general blade shape, but also in the type of blade it emits. Now where have I heard something like this before? Perhaps some sort of weapon known for producing a large variety of projectiles. I am, of course, referring to Busters. As covered in the What Exactly Are Busters video, Busters are basically a highly variable weapon which can produce any number of shot or projectiles or effects from their emitter gems, found in the center of the barrel. While we never really get a good look at the inside of Zero's saber, I would imagine that there is a similar emitter gem in there, allowing Zero's saber to create the various kinds of blades he uses in addition to his default energy blade. Actually, while making this video, my good pal ColemanX brought this image to my attention. Now, I know that the Mega Man X mangas and comics are their own continuity, but it would seem that Iwamoto interpreted the inside of the beam emitter to also be a gem, just like a Buster has. If we can assume this to be true, then Busters and Sabers work on very similar principles but produce different outputs. Much like how Busters simply take energy and materialize it into the shape needed for the selected weapon, the Z-Saber likely does the exact same process but for different kinds of saber blades. Whether or not every beam saber is able to do this, I couldn't tell you. In fact, I don't think that it is likely. My guess is that through the use of Zero's technique learning system, he somehow reconfigures his Z-Saber on the fly to produce the desired blade type. It could even be that without learning the technique, he may not know how to configure his saber to produce the desired blade, which is why he must defeat bosses to learn how. If he discards their technique data, then presumably the blade configuration is also lost. Zero is no stranger to other kinds of weapons, however. In Mega Man X7, new kinds of weapons are introduced, each one with their own distinct blade shape and functionality. This includes the V-Hanger, a double set of beam daggers which throw a cutting beam blade when swung. As established earlier, this is possible even for the regular Z-Saber under the right circumstances. The D-Glaive is a polearm style weapon with a curved blade on the end. What it may lack in the length of the blade, it more than makes up for in the length of the handle itself, being quite long, allowing for Zero to perform various spins and twirls with it, as well as long-range straight thrusts. Moving into X8, Zero also obtains a few new weapons, such as the B-Fan, which is an interesting take on beam weapon technology. Rather than create a pointed blade of any kind, the blades are fanned out in a fan shape. This gives them a wide surface area, which allows them to show off their primary function as a defensive weapon. With such a wide surface area, the fans are able to block and reflect incoming projectiles, covering Zero almost entirely and protecting him from harm, capitalizing on the beam weapon's ability to reflect shots. The T-Breaker is another interesting beam weapon, in that rather than creating some sort of cutting blade, it would appear that the energy is spread out into a square shape along the end of the hammer. So rather than a beam blade of any kind, it's really more like a beam smashy flattening thing. This would seem to make use of the surging energy inside of the beam surface area more than anything. Whatever you smash with this hammer isn't just experiencing the blunt force trauma of the hammer, it is also getting surged with the energy of the beam. The K-Knuckle operates on a similar principle to the T-Breaker. Rather than any sort of blade, the energy is focused into two focal points across Zero's knuckles, where the energy is meant to inflict blunt impact force, rather than to puncture or cut anything. These essentially enhance any of Zero's unarmed combat techniques by giving his fists a bit of a bump in damage. All of these weapons, of course, can be augmented through the use of Zero's techniques, imbuing them with elemental energy, or even unlocking new techniques based on which weapon is currently equipped. For instance, Zero has a spinning rising uppercut technique with his default Z-Saber called Kyoryusho. But when the K-Knuckle is equipped, it turns into a rapid spinning uppercut with his fists, called Shoryuken. That's spelled with two U's, by the way, not to be confused with a regular Shoryuken. Zero isn't the only beam saber user in town, of course. Sticking to X8, there is Lair too. Lair makes use of the L-Rapier, which, as the name implies, is a very thin, pointed blade, presumably for quick, rapid strikes. Zero even gets his own Z-Rapier in Mega Man X Command Mission, along with many other beam weapons and even some physical blades, each with their own unique features, though they all never deviate too far from the basic functionality of a Z-Saber besides their special effects. Sigma has been known to employ many beam weapons across the series. For instance, in Mega Man X4, Sigma uses a beam scythe to complete his Grim Reaper motif. Interestingly, the scythe seems to always be surging with electricity, and the blade appears to be very intense, so much so that when it is thrown into the ground or walls, it will send balls of electricity surging through the surface it is currently stuck into. Not one to be outdone, Red of X7 has a double-ended beam scythe which he can throw and also emit energy waves from. But before Red, there was Dynamo, who has his own double-ended beam saber, which he too can throw like a boomerang. Strangely, Dynamo is able to duplicate his beam saber and can throw multiples of them all around the battlefield, which then sit in place for a while before flying towards the target. Where he is getting all these beam sabers from is beyond me. Notably, his beam saber appears to be of the crescent variety, especially when he performs his humongous aerial slash. Double from X4 does away with silly things like a saber hilt, and instead opts to have his beam blades mounted directly on his wrist. Interestingly, his blades are depicted in some artwork as being a little wavy and squiggly in nature, but no less deadly. I've always taken this to mean that his blades are extremely hot, and perhaps surging with a lot of energy, which would explain why he's able to cut through those Maverick Hunters in that one cutscene so easily. It's not just the superstars who get to have all the beam weapon fun. Even the simple Degraver enemy from Command Mission, which seems to be an evolution of the Dig Labor enemy from X1, uses a pickaxe with a sharp beam at the point for chopping and picking through the earth, and your chest cavity. I mentioned this in the Buster video, but even X gets his own kind of beam saber in the form of the Blade Armor, where his entire Buster becomes a blade emitter and creates a massive broadsword style blade. Even Ride Armors can have beam weaponry attached to them. In X4, the Raiden Ride Armor has a wrist-mounted blade emitter that can activate when it throws a punch, usually a straight jab, and then an overhead slash. It can also charge up its punch, resulting in a violent energy blade flashing out of the wrist emitter. When released, the Ride Armor slides forward in a dashing punch. The blade is very powerful and will destroy almost anything it comes into contact with. In Mega Man Zero, in addition to the Triangle Blade, Zero acquires several unique beam weapons. The Shield Boomerang is effectively a spinning shield of energy which can both reflect shots back at attackers and be thrown like a frisbee, which cuts through most targets. The shield then returns to Zero like, well, a boomerang. Similar to this, Phantom of the Four Guardians has a beam shuriken style weapon, which has 4 points. When thrown, he is even able to somehow jump on top of it and ride it around. The Triple Rod is similar to the previously mentioned D-Glaive, in that it is a polearm style weapon which can be used for thrusting stabs or spun by Zero for multiple hits. Each time it is thrust, it can be extended up to 3 times for additional range and hits, hence Triple Rod. An evolution of the Triple Rod is the Chain Rod, effectively the same as the Triple Rod, except instead of a rigid extending pole, it is a series of chain links with a spearhead on the end, allowing for Zero to impale and pull things towards him, or to stick it into the ceiling and swing from it. Unfortunately, the artwork for this weapon shows Zero swinging it around like a whip or a chainsword. It's unfortunate that we never get to use it this way in-game. A further evolution of the Triple Rod is the Recoil Rod, which gives Zero a sort of Tonfa-style weapon. It effectively allows Zero to throw rapid-fire left and right punches, impacting with the sharp, pointed ends of the weapon. When charged, an enormous release of energy is focused to the front of the rod and punts enemies away with great force. When aimed at the ground, Zero can do the same thing and launch himself away. And just so Harpooya isn't left out, he also sports a pair of beam sabers, which appear to be slightly shorter than Zero's singular saber, both of which are of course Dorito-shaped. I'm not sure if this one counts as a beam weapon, but it would seem that when users of Model P shoot their default weapon, they are actually creating tiny beam kunai daggers. Normally, I would chalk this one up to being a buster weapon, but the kunai daggers appear to behave like a physical object when they hit a shielded enemy or wall. Not to mention, the ability to shape a blade into any given shape is more an attribute of beam weapons than it is to busters, which generally just shoot generic blobs of energy, and not something as specific as a kunai dagger. Which, now that I'm on the topic of ninjas, makes me wonder what the Shadow Armor Buster is categorized under, considering that it shoots shuriken shots. Furthermore, the charged attack for Model P releases a beam shuriken just like Phantom. leaving me to believe that the regular kunai are indeed meant to be beam weapons. In addition to all of this, Model P is even able to produce a sort of beam claw, allowing the user to hang from the ceiling. The application of beam technology never ceases to amaze. I nearly forgot, but there's actually some beam weaponry in the Legends era of games. To briefly recap, there is a special weapon called the Blade Arm that turns Walnut's arm into a blade emitter. Rather than a handle, the blade comes straight out of an emitter where his hand would normally be. In Legends 1, the blade appears to be a bit jagged, similar to the crackling, burning-looking blades seen in Mega Man X4 and X5. Walnut simply swipes his arm diagonally downwards in a simple slash. The blade appears to be rather powerful, given that when he swings it, it creates an intense flash, as though he's cutting through the air. Interestingly, when upgraded properly, the blade arm can even throw blade beams, something that we've seen in previous games already. In Legends 2, Walnut once again can obtain the blade arm. This time around, the blade is a bit of a rainbow color rather than the plain orange one like in Legends 1. This time around, the blade arm cannot be upgraded to throw beam blades, but the length of the blade can be greatly increased. Furthermore, Walnut can even perform a sort of two-hit combo, resulting in a jumping slash. Lastly for Walnut, there is the shield arm. The shield arm is seemingly another beam weapon, which creates a wide circular barrier in front of Walnut, somewhat similar to the shield boomerang, though it is clearly not spinning and cannot be thrown, as it is connected to his arm. What is interesting is that if you use the shield arm at point blank, it actually damages enemies, as if knocking them back with the force of the energy. The shield arm actually comes back in Legends 2, but it seems to function completely differently. Rather than being a beam shield similar to the B-fan in X8, which covers a flat but wide radius, the Legends 2 shield arm seems to give Walnut a whole body force field, encasing him in a bubble. Though, notably, the energy used appears to be the same kind of rainbow spectrum energy used for the blade arm, so it's possible that this force field is actually still a beam weapon rather than a traditional force field. The weapon Rolling Shield comes to mind when I see Walnut use this, simply absorbing shots as they collide with the bubble. And since I did it last time, I may as well touch briefly upon Battle Network. In Battle Network, beam weapons are not as varied as in the regular series, almost exclusively consisting of different kinds of swords. The most basic of these, of course, being the battle chip, Sword. Using the battle chip transforms the user's forearm into a blade emitter, wherein, of course, an energy blade is then formed, almost always a straight blade with a pointed tip, looking somewhat like a broadsword. The next step up from this would be Longsword, which visually appears to just be a longer version of the usual sword blade. Then there's Wide Sword, which is visually a bit different. The blade emitter itself seems wider than usual to fit the larger blade, and has a diamond-shaped head at the end of the blade, able to strike a wider area, as the name would imply. There is also Elemental-type swords, which produce a skinnier-looking emitter, and rather than a typical sword blade, seem to just be a pointed straight blade made up of whatever element is selected, be it elect, aqua, or fire. In addition to the sword-type chips, there is also the blade family of chips, which appear to be a stronger version of the sword chips. These are rather unique, in that from the blade emitter, there also seems to be a physical curved blade in the middle, with the element chosen surrounding it. There are many different kinds of sword chips throughout the entirety of Battle Network. However, I don't have too much to really say on them outside of their visual differences. All I can say is that the blades do appear to be sharp, and do appear to cut things like their regular series counterparts. The fact is, in Battle Network, everything is data. I can't exactly comment on the way that the blades function in that world's version of cyberspace, because it's just data. It just does what it is programmed to do. I am well aware of all the different types of sword chips and blade chips, and their various unique functionalities in battle, but at that point, all I would be doing is explaining how battle chips work, and I would much rather save that for their own video. There's really not too much to say on the physics of Battle Network energy blades because there's not really any physics involved. It's all data. But don't you worry, Battle Network fans, you'll have your time soon enough. In conclusion, beam weapons have a massive variety of applications. They can take on many different shapes, seemingly whatever shape you could ever want. In addition, the energy they emit can be wild and crackling with power, or refined down to a straight beam, or even flattened into a razor with the right kind of technology. They don't have to necessarily be weapons, sometimes taking on the form of a utility claw, or the tip of a pickaxe. They can even appear on ride armors to enhance their punching ability. Sometimes they aren't even made into blades at all, focused instead into blunt forms, meant for impacting with great force. Or they can be spread across wide areas and used as shields to reflect or block incoming attacks. Some of them can fling waves of energy, and others can be flung themselves, returning back to their owners. They may not follow any conventional laws of physics, but that's because they follow the rule of cool, and the only thing cooler than a melee weapon is one made up of glowy energy. Whether they are a weapon you hold, or just an extension of your body, beam weapons are a staple part of the Mega Man universe. I hope you, hoo-ha, had a great time watching this video. This is Twitch, signing out. The artwork for this video is created by Midas. Please go to the description and check out their work. This video was brought to you by the following Kronos Institute staff members: Tomahawk Man 6, Silby, Super Terra, Dan15689, Mugen 0, Rockman Cosmo, Air, Jachow 64, Jinxif, Reploid 404, Crystal Majestica, LML123, Power Guy, Mega Spam X, Uatcher, Batasaur, Hikaru, I Metalloid X, Shu Shuriken, Time Temple, Ben CD the Sky Patroller, Dr. Catfish, Grand Finale, Excellent Excels, Ringabeast 15, Eugene 1981, Jamal Simmons, and DBLCZX.